This is note taker 21 on kingdom fungi. Okay. Kingdom fungi are members of the domain Eukarya, and if you remember a couple of note takers back, we talked about what a eukaryote was. A eukaryote is a living thing where its cells actually have a nucleus inside of the cell to protect the genetic material. Now, with our fungi, all of the members of our fungus kingdom are going to be eukaryotes. They are also all going to be heterotrophs. This is another word we introduced a few note takers back. If you look at the word wall in the classroom, hetero means different, trophos means feeder. So a heterotroph is a living thing that needs to find their food in another source. So with our fungus kingdom, some of the fungus do this by actually growing on their food source. The fungus will then release chemicals and digest the substance that they are on, and then they'll absorb the digested material. Some fungus can actually capture their food. Some will actually have these little thread-like hyphae under the ground that act like little nooses, and if an unwary little insect of some sort, or even a type of worm, makes it through one of these nooses and gets trapped, then the fungus will actually release chemicals to stun the prey and then digest the organism that they have caught. Other fungus can even get their food through symbiotic relationships. Some are parasitic and harm the host that they're on. Others actually form a good symbiotic relationship and they help the host that they're with. And then some of our fungus are going to act as decomposers. This was another term we mentioned, or we introduced a few note takers back. A decomposer is something that breaks down dead things and actually gets their nutrients from those dead things. Now, with the structure of fungus, we're going to have two very different types of structure in the fungus, because we do have some fungus that are unicellular. Unicellular fungi are going to be made of only one cell, and you can look at the word wall in the classroom and you see that the prefix uni means one. And an example of a unicellular fungus would be yeast. So its structure is going to be much different from our multicellular fungus. Our multicellular fungus are going to be fungus that are made of many cells. Now with our multicellular fungus, they are going to be made up of thread-like tubes that are called hyphae. And the hyphae branch and weave together to produce the different shapes, all the way from a very loose, kind of a fuzzy mold to a very tight, densely packed system of hyphae that would make up a mushroom. And with these hyphae, they actually grow very, very quickly. Some mushrooms you can go to bed at night and your yard will be completely free of mushrooms, and you can wake up the next morning and there will be mushrooms everywhere. So hyphae can actually grow very quickly and grow a full-grown mushroom overnight. Here's an example in these pictures of some hyphae, the thread-like tubes that grow through the soil, and you will see on the right-hand side the mushrooms that are forming on the top of the surface. And here we have mushrooms that are actually growing in what we call a fairy ring, and there's lots of mythology and lore surrounding these fairy rings. Not all good, and we'll talk more about these legends in class. Now, when we talk about multicellular fungus, they're not going to be multicellular in the same way that plants and animals are multicellular. In plants and animals, each cell is a separate entity. It's a little distinct unit. However, when we look at the hyphae that make up multicellular fungus, they're actually going to be a continuous thread, and the cell walls that go across are not going to go from side to side. So it's almost like a maze of passageways through the hyphae, and the cytoplasm, along with the many nuclei that are found in there, can actually move throughout the entire hyphae. Now, even though they're incomplete compartments, these compartments are considered cells. Now, the place in multicellular fungus where you actually will have totally distinct units of cells are going to be at the tips of the hyphae, and these are going to be made up of the reproductive cells of the fungus. When we talk about reproduction in fungus, they're not going to reproduce by mitosis or binary fission or things that we've talked about so far this year. Actually, many of your fungus are going to reproduce by spores, and spores are tiny reproductive cells. They're going to be enclosed within a cell wall, and these spores, your fungus needs to get these spores away from the parent plant, the parent fungus, so that they can land somewhere where hopefully conditions will be right and they will grow. So a lot of your fungus will rely on things like water, clothing, animal hair, the wind, to be able to take these spores and spread them to another location. The spores are going to be produced in a structure called the fruiting body. In some of the fungus that we're going to look at, the fruiting body is actually a stalk with the fruiting body on top, and the top part is going to be a cluster of spores. Other fungus are going to be more of a complex fruiting body on the top of it, where it's going to be closely packed hyphae that are going to have trillions of spores inside. One example of this would be a puffball mushroom, where you have that tightly packed hyphae. The spores are in the center of the puffball, and that puffball will burst open, and it does rely on the wind and animals to be able to carry these spores away. These pictures are examples of the fruiting bodies of some of our fungus, and you can see some are stalks with spores, the little kind of pocket of spores at the top, or you'll also see on here the mushroom off to the right. The fruiting body of the mushroom is underneath the cap, where there are structures called gills, and these gills do produce the spores and will drop them down to the ground. And the little mushroom at the top is a type of the puffball, where the center part there, that almost looks like a little biscuit sitting on top, that will actually burst open if it feels threatened, if something brushes up against it, and it'll kind of poof the spores out away from itself. With our fungus, there are three examples of fungus that you're going to need to know. You're going to need to know the mushroom, molds, and you're going to need to know yeasts. Our first two, our mushrooms and our molds, are going to be multicellular fungus, while the yeast will be our unicellular fungus. With our mushrooms, they're going to have a stem-like structure that we call a stalk. And the stalks of some of these mushrooms are decorated with a ring that almost looks like a little skirt on it. No, if you see it, it does not mean that that mushroom is female. At the top of the stalk is going to be a cap, and it's almost like a hat on your head. That's why we call it a cap. And the spores are going to be produced on the underside of the cap on little thin sheets of tissue called gills. These gills are very different from when you think of the gills on a fish. The gills of a fish are made for breathing. The gills here are going to be for production of the reproductive cells called spores. On the next slide, you will see a picture of a mushroom, and the parts will be labeled. If they're not labeled in your notes yet, please do so. Up in the top left-hand corner, I have pictures of a cluster of mushrooms, and on the bottom right, I have the 4 parts of the mushroom that you will need to know for your fungus quiz. The very top of the mushroom is called the cap, and underneath you see the little sheets of tissue that come with little stripes underneath. These are the gills where the spores are produced. Then we have the stalk, which is the stem of the mushroom, and around it sometimes you will have where it looks like some of it has pulled away and made a little skirt. That is called a ring. And again, you will need to know these 4 parts and be able to label them for the quiz. Yeasts are going to be our unicellular fungus that is made of one individual cell. And with our yeasts, we do use them in our life for both good and bad things. There are some yeasts that on the bad side can make infections in us. However, we do have some good yeasts. We have yeasts that are used in cooking breads or making alcohols. As the yeast grows and starts to feed when you're putting it before you're making the bread dough, you actually activate the yeast. You put it in a little bit of warm water with some sugar in it, and the yeast is going to feed off of the sugar, and it's going to produce a carbon dioxide gas. And when you mix this in the bread dough, as the yeast is making carbon dioxide gas, your bread dough will start to rise. And then you put the bread in the oven, and then that's how you get the fluffy bread that has the little, looks like the little air bubbles inside. Other uses for yeast include the production of fuels, vitamins, we can make alcohols, and we can also make medicines out of it. And unlike our other fungus, which are going to reproduce by spores, because your yeast is only one single cell, it's not going to make spores. It's actually going to reproduce by a process called budding. And budding is when a little yeast starts to grow off of the bigger yeast cell. And then eventually that forms a little bud off of the side, and that bud will then break away and grow into its own yeast cell. Here are some pictures. On the left-hand side are cells of yeast under the microscope, and if you look at the bottom picture is showing a yeast cell that is actually budding, and eventually the little piece on the right will break off and become its own yeast cell. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I show you all the different ways that you can buy yeast in a store. You can buy little packets. Sometimes they'll come in a little glass container. And for people who do a lot of baking, you can get a giant bag of yeast. That's going to be for people who make lots and lots of bread and baked items at their home. The last type of fungus we're going to talk about are going to be molds. And a lot of times when you think of molds, you think of kind of the not so good way that mold interacts with our life when it starts to grow on our food, and that's a way that we can see that our food is gone bad. However, there are very good uses for mold. There are beneficial molds in our life. We can use molds to create antibiotics. The most popular, most famous, is the penicillium mold, and that's used to make the antibiotic penicillin. And this penicillin is something that we take to kill off bad bacteria that are making us sick. Molds can also be used in the making of foods. If you've ever had tofu, if you've ever used soy sauce, certain cheeses, especially blue cheese, the actual blue streaks in blue cheese is a mold. So we can have some beneficial uses for mold. Up in the top left-hand corner, we have penicillium mold. This is actually used to make the antibiotic penicillin, which is used to keep us healthy, kill off bad bacteria. The bottom left-hand corner is tofu, which is a kind of a soy product that is used to replace meat products for people who are vegetarian. Up in the top right-hand corner, we have blue cheese, and if you see the blue coloration throughout that cheese, those are molds growing in that cheese that give it that kind of pungent flavor that it has. And in the bottom right-hand corner is soy sauce, and that's something that probably everybody in here has used, and it does bring quite a lot of flavoring to our food. Here would be an example of a bad mold. This is bread mold. And on the left-hand side, you see that this has been actually magnified under the microscope. And what makes the bread mold look all fluffy is that it's little stalks. And at the top, the tan parts that you see, those are little clusters of spores that are then going to spread out and make more mold on your bread. And I did put on the right-hand side a really nasty pack of really, really molded bread, so you can kind of really see that mold growing on it. And when you do see the mold growing on the bread, that's when you need to decide to throw that bread out. You definitely do not want to eat it. This next part of the note taker, we're going to talk about the effects of fungus on our life. Now, fungus is going to interact with organisms in a variety of ways. Some are going to be very good, like us using it to make foods or antibiotics. We can use it to make our breads, our yeast to make breads. Mushrooms we use as a food source for us. But on the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some not so nice ways that fungus interacts with our life. The first one I'm going to talk about is how some fungus can actually cause disease in plants. They can actually cause the roots, the stem, or the fruit of the plants to rot or decay. Others create a disease, like the Dutch elm disease is a fungus that does affect a Dutch elm tree, and it can actually kill the tree. There are some that turn the kernels of grain into useless fungal spores, so we lose lots of crops that way from these fungus. Another type of fungus, we have some that can affect crops that are stored away, waiting to be used, like our wheat, our corn, our peanuts, our rice. Lots of crops each year are destroyed by different types of fungus. Here's an example of a fungus that does attack a plant. This is called corn smut. It's a fungus that gets in the ear of the corn as it's forming, and then you can see instead of growing an ear of corn, it has actually changed it into an entire almost like pocket of fungal spores. These will then spread and affect the other stalks of corn. Here we have one called wheat rust. It's that reddish looking color that is growing on the wheat stalks, and this does ruin the crops so that we can no longer use them. In addition to just ruining crops, some fungus will actually produce a toxin or a type of poison that can actually injure or kill humans and animals. One such fungus is that grows on a grain that causes liver cancer or even death for some humans. There's another one called ergot, which is actually a fungus that grows on the grains of rye, which we make rye bread out of. And people who ingest or eat these grains that could be infected by these fungus can experience burning, convulsions, hallucinations. Sometimes it can even cause your circulation to become cut off, and people have had to amputate or lose limbs because of this. And earlier in the note taker, I showed you the picture of the fairy ring, and in class we're going to talk about some of the legends that surround these fairy rings, but there are also some ways that science uses this fungus, these fungal infections, to actually explain some of the mythologies, such as lycanthropy or werewolves, and the witch trials of Salem. We're going to talk a little bit about those in class and how science wonders if these fungal infections could have been a part of what was causing people to react the way they did. This is actually a picture of ergot. The dark spikes growing off of the rye grain are the fungus. And I know you're probably looking at the picture going, why would anybody eat this when they saw it? But in earlier times, hundreds of years ago, when they first saw this, that was not something that they knew about. So when they would grind up the grain or process the grain to make breads, all of the different parts of it got processed together, and unfortunately the people would then ingest this fungus within the breads and get very sick. It's not just plants that are infected by fungal infections. Humans and other animals can also be infected by fungal infections. We have fatal lung disease that can affect poultry. We have some that cause sores on the skin of our pets. Another type is nail fungus. Causes your nails to grow crooked and eventually fall off. Ringworm is a fungal infection. You'll see a picture on the next slide of the ringworm. And We have athlete's foot, which is a fungal infection that we get, and it's called athlete's foot because the fungus likes a moist, warm area to grow, which people who are athletes and are sweating in their shoes have an increased chance of getting these fungal infections. We also have yeast infections, which are very uncomfortable. So lots of different types of infections that can affect our animal kingdom also. Here are some examples of nail fungus. And here are some examples of ringworm. Ringworm is not a worm, it's actually a fungal infection, and you get a little area on your arm. It's like a little red splotch. It's extremely contagious and actually easily treatable. You can go to the store and buy antifungal cream and put it on there, and then keep a band-aid over it to prevent you spreading it all over your body or passing it to your pet. And unfortunately, sometimes we get it from our pets. This top left picture here shows the picture of somebody's pet dog. They've picked up ringworm somewhere, probably been outside, picked it up, bringing it into the house, and then the little dog is cuddling up next to you at night, and you're catching ringworm from the dog. A couple other good uses for fungus, other than using it to make foods, things like that. There are some fungus that we can use to make pesticides. Pesticides are things that we put on our crops to keep the insects from eating our crops. And the nice thing is when we use the fungus to make the pesticide, it's a more natural chemical that we're putting on rather than making all these crazy chemicals in the lab and putting it on foods, our food products that eventually we'll eat. Also, some plants actually get help from fungus. The fungus will actually attach to the roots of some of the plants and spread out through the soil, and it can actually help the plant gather more nutrients from the surrounding soil. The last thing I'm going to talk about on this note taker is a type of symbiotic relationship. And you've heard this word on and off through the note takers, symbiosis. And symbiosis is when two different living things work together. And sometimes it's a good bad relationship where one of them benefits, the other's getting something bad out of the deal, harmed or killed. But with our fungus, this last thing I'm going to talk about is actually a symbiotic relationship that is a good relationship. It is called a lichen. A lichen is a fungus and an algae that actually live together. The fungus is going to provide the algae with water and minerals that the algae needs, and then the algae is going to make a food source for the fungus. So these lichens are actually a community of two living things that are helping each other survive. Now with our lichens, sometimes lichens will grow on rocks, they'll grow on trees. When they grow on rocks, they actually help to break down rocks to form soil so other organisms can grow. And they're also a good indicator of air pollution. Lichens do not like to grow where there's a lot of pollution. So if you were to go out in front of the school on the road out here, if you were to look at all the trees down the road, you're probably not going to find many lichens because you have a lot of exhaust and pollution from the cars that travel. However, if you were to go to the woods behind the school where the air is cleaner because there's no traffic back there, you could actually, as you're walking through the woods, find lichens on the trees. And lichens, we can actually collect them and use them for natural dye products for things like wool fabrics. Here is a picture of a lichen. You've probably seen these before. They almost look like they're little papery structures that you could peel off the barks of the tree or off of a rock. Now this is the end of Note Taker 21. Please do not forget to complete the assessment that follows.